She wrote a love note on a napkin, not knowing he owned the whole company. The smell of fresh cornbread and bacon drifted through the morning air of Maple Hollow Diner, nestled on the edge of a sleepy farming town in Nebraska. Grace Summers moved between the booths with a practiced rhythm, her apron already dusted with flour from the breakfast rush. "He's here again," murmured Clara, the line cook, as she peeked through the kitchen window. Grace glanced toward the corner booth by the window, the same one every Tuesday morning. There he was. Flannel shirt, worn jeans, boots with mud still clinging to the soles. The man they only knew as the quiet farmer. He never said much, always ordered black coffee and sourdough toast. And he always tipped generously. Too generously, for someone who looked like he barely made enough to fill his gas tank. Grace sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You know what, Clara? I'm gonna do it." "Do what?" "I'm leaving a note this time, on the napkin. Just something small." Clara raised an eyebrow, half amused, half concerned. "You've been saying that for months." "I know, but he keeps coming back. Same seat, same eyes like he's listening to a story no one else can hear. And every time, I lose my nerve. But today feels different." Clara smirked. "All right, Grace, I dare you. Write your little love letter." Grace rolled her eyes. "It's not a love letter, it's just a note." Still, her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed a fresh napkin from the dispenser. As she poured his coffee, her heart picked up speed. She folded the napkin neatly and wrote in small, careful print, "You make the morning feel quieter in the best way. Ever thought of saying hello back?" She placed the cup, the toast, and the folded napkin on the tray, then walked toward the booth. Her boots thudded softly on the old wooden floor. "Morning," she said, setting the tray down. "Coffee and toast, just the way you like it." The man looked up, eyes calm, unreadable. "Thanks," he said, voice low, gravelly. Grace offered a smile and turned back quickly before her cheeks betrayed her. As she passed the counter, Clara gave her a knowing grin. "I did it," Grace whispered. She watched from behind the register as the man unfolded the napkin. His brow furrowed slightly, then relaxed. No outward smile, no words. But he reached into his coat pocket and laid a crisp 20 under the plate, twice his usual tip. Then he stood, tugged his cap low over his eyes, and walked out without a word. Grace's chest sank and swelled all at once. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something she hadn't dared hope for. Luke Whitaker wasn't who he seemed to be. Not to the waitress with flour on her sleeves, not to the quiet town of Maple Hollow, and certainly not to the diner that had become his Tuesday ritual. To them, he was just another rancher, a man with dust on his boots and calluses on his hands, the kind who kept to himself, said little, and never made trouble. And that's exactly how Luke liked it. Because under the flannel shirts and unshaven jaw was the CEO of Crescent Agritech, one of the largest sustainable farming networks in the Midwest. He had spent years behind conference tables and inside glass towers, years pretending that suits and vision statements made him feel fulfilled. They didn't. 3 months ago, after a board meeting left him more drained than decisive, Luke had driven aimlessly down old highways until his GPS lost signal. That was when he stumbled across Maple Hollow, a town too small to be on most maps, with just one diner, one gas station, and one heart that beat slow and steady. He parked beside a battered feed store and wandered into Maple Hollow Diner, craving coffee, not connection. Then he saw her. Grace. She didn't smile like a server trained to. She smiled like someone who meant it, and when she poured his coffee and said, "You look like someone who's seen both too much sun and too many spreadsheets," he nearly laughed, almost. From that day on, he returned every Tuesday, not to check up on operations, not to observe small-town supply chains or scout potential investments. He came to watch Grace Summers scribble notes in the margins of crossword puzzles, to hear her hum when she wiped down the counter, to catch her laughing with the elderly man who sat at table 5, or helping the shy kid from the high school cross-country team count change. Luke had been watched all his life by shareholders, executives, competitors, but no one had ever looked at him the way Grace did. Not like a man with power, just a man who needed coffee and quiet. So when she left a note that Tuesday morning, it did something to him, stirred something long silent. The napkin was still in his pocket now, creased and soft from his fingertips running over it again and again. Want the nah. You make the morning feel quieter in the best way. Ever thought of saying hello back? He hadn't planned on replying. Not directly. But that afternoon, Luke sat alone in the guest house he'd rented under a different name. The air smelled of cedar and rain. His laptop sat open. A new social media account blinked at him, blank and waiting. Name, Miles Carter. Bio. Just a guy who likes early mornings and better coffee. And with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, Luke typed his first message. Hi, I think you served me once. Best coffee I've ever had. Grace read the message 3 times before she believed it was real. Hi, I think you served me once. Best coffee I've ever had. The sender's name was Miles Carter. She didn't recognize it. His profile was vague. No personal photos, just a blurry snapshot of a coffee mug on a windowsill, and a quote that read, "Kindness doesn't require a reason." She hesitated before replying. It could be anyone, she reasoned, but there was something oddly familiar about the tone, the simplicity, the quiet. Thanks, she finally wrote back. I try to make every cup count. That might have been it, but Miles replied again, not right away, not too fast, but just soon enough to show he was waiting. That's rare. Most people just hand over the coffee and disappear. Well, Grace replied, her fingers tapping more confidently now, disappearing is overrated. And so it began. Their messages were casual at first. He asked about her favorite roasts, whether she preferred drip or pour over. She teased him about adding sugar. He told her that mornings were his quiet time, and she said they were her battlefield. Chai. Hippie shep, 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 niasad and kalam chuppy. Hippie shep, 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 bishep. Grace didn't talk much about herself, not at first. But the more they spoke, the more she found herself slipping pieces of her life into the conversation. Her mother's health, her part-time studies in nursing, the way she liked arranging flowers at the diner even if no one noticed. And Miles, whoever he really was, listened. Always. You ever think about leaving? He asked one night. Maple Hollow, she replied. Sometimes. But I think sometimes a place is more than its size. It's about the people who look for you when you don't show up. The ones who remember your favorite kind of pie. I don't know, maybe I'm just sentimental. Or maybe you're just someone who makes any place feel like home, he wrote. Grace had to set her phone down when she read that. She sat in silence for a long time, her heart aching in the most unexpected way, because this stranger, Miles, was starting to feel familiar, more familiar than anyone had in a long, long time. And somewhere, in a rented guest house miles away, Luke reread her messages under the soft hum of an old lamp, his heart just as full and just as unsteady. He hadn't meant to keep writing her, but somehow, with every sentence Grace typed, he remembered what it meant to be seen. Not for a title, not for a legacy, but for the kind of man he hoped he still was. Night came softly in Maple Hollow, settling over the fields like a warm quilt. Grace lay curled on her side, her phone casting a gentle glow across her pillow. The town was asleep, but she was wide awake, waiting. Hey, came the message at 9:46 p.m. Rough day? She smiled before she even replied. Mr. Thompson spilled maple syrup on the jukebox again. That poor jukebox. Do you ever get hazard pay for that job? She laughed quietly. Not unless you count old men tipping in peppermint candies. It had become a ritual. Every evening, a small window of peace with Miles. No pressure, no expectations. Just honest, easy connection. Some nights they talked about nothing at all. Favorite sandwich combinations, who made the best pie in the county. Grace insisted it was Clara's peach cobbler. Other nights they went deeper. Wounds, regrets, dreams neither had spoken aloud before. And in that quiet, Grace found something she hadn't realized she'd lost. Trust. One night her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing, "There's this guy. At the diner? Yeah. Comes in every Tuesday. Never says much. But, I don't know. He makes everything feel quieter. Like I can breathe better when he's there." There was a long pause on the other end. Then came Miles's reply. "He sounds lucky." To have your attention. Grace's breath caught. She hadn't said it to fish for reassurance. But Miles's words landed like a soft blanket on cold skin, unexpectedly warm. Sometimes I think I'm too much. Too loud, too soft, too all over the place. No, he wrote back almost instantly. You're exactly enough. She held the phone to her chest for a moment, blinking up at the ceiling. In another town, not so far away, Luke sat on the edge of a modest bed, staring at the same glowing thread of messages. He hadn't meant to fall. Not like this. He had just wanted to understand her, to know what moved someone like Grace to light up a room without ever asking for attention. But now it was more than curiosity, more than admiration. It was a quiet longing, because Miles, the name he had borrowed, could say all the things that Luke never had the courage to. And for now, that was enough. Until one night, Grace wrote something that made his stomach twist. Talking to you makes me believe again that maybe some people aren't pretending. Luke's fingers hovered above the screen. He didn't want to break this, didn't want to lose her trust. But deep inside, a storm had begun to brew, because Miles Carter didn't exist, and Grace was falling for him anyway. The weeks passed like chapters in a book neither of them wanted to end. Every night, Grace and Miles met in that quiet corner of the internet, weaving pieces of themselves into conversation, thread by thread, word by word. She told him about the long winters after her father passed, about how she and her mother had once slept in the same bed to stay warm, how grief had a strange way of stretching time. She talked about the year her mom got sick, the smell of hospital antiseptic, the constant ache of not being enough. Miles never interrupted, never filled the silence with pity, just asked gentle questions and offered warmth in the spaces where the world had once been cold. If you could do anything, he asked one evening, what would it be? Design healing spaces, she replied. Hospitals, clinics, community centers, places that don't feel like you're already halfway broken just walking in. That sounds beautiful. It's just a dream. Then I hope you never stop chasing it. She had told herself not to get attached, not to lean into the way her heart fluttered when his name appeared on her screen. But it was too late. There was something about him. Miles. He never asked for photos, never flirted for the sake of it. He listened. He remembered. And he replied like every word she wrote mattered. One night, she confessed something small, but tender. I think I stopped believing people meant what they said a long time ago. But with you, it feels different. Luke sat in the dark with that message lighting up his screen. He could see her in his mind, maybe wrapped in an old quilt, maybe curled up beside a cracked window with the cicadas chirping just beyond. He imagined her thumb hovering, hesitant but hopeful, before hitting send. He wanted to reply, "You could talk for hours, and I'd never stop listening." But Miles wouldn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he typed, "I don't want to be someone who lets you down." And when she wrote back, "Then don't," he felt the weight of the lie he'd carried begin to sink deeper. Because Luke wasn't just Miles, and Miles wasn't real. He had never meant for it to go this far. But Grace had trusted him, opened her heart to him, believed in him. And what began as a napkin and a name had become something Luke could no longer ignore. He was falling in love, not as a stranger, not as a CEO, but as a man who never expected to be seen for who he truly was. And he knew, deep down, that the truth would break something fragile if he waited too long to tell her. But telling her meant risking everything. It happened on a quiet Thursday. Grace had just finished a long shift. Her back ached, and her fingers were raw from scrubbing down the booths after a spill of sweet tea and ranch dressing. She made tea, pulled on her favorite hoodie, and curled up on the couch. It was raining outside. Her phone buzzed. Miles. Long day? Grace. I swear, if one more person asks for extra crispy bacon but not too crispy, I might lose it. Miles. Maybe the real test of patience is working the breakfast shift. She chuckled. They continued chatting, easy, flowing, until he wrote, "Maybe Mr. Bacon Guy should sit at table 3 and think about what he's done." Grace froze. Her fingers stopped mid-type. No. Table 3. No. That was her table. His table. Toe. The quiet man in flannel. The one who sat every Tuesday, ordered toast and black coffee, never said much. The one she had left a napkin note for, next same heckler. She'd never mentioned the table number to Miles. Not once. The message sat there, innocent to anyone else. But to her, it felt like a spotlight. Mix feet do, her heart pounded. What did you just say? She typed. No reply. She clicked on Miles's profile again. It was still vague, still neat. Too perfect. Ah. And suddenly, too familiar. Ah. A sinking feeling twisted in her stomach. She got up, opened her laptop, and began searching. Ah. It took less than an hour. Bakkel van two parfumals afemals amals. One reverse image search. A local business journal article. A keynote speech from 2 years ago. Then it hit her like a freight train. Luke Whitaker, CEO of Crescent Agritech. Same eyes, same jawline. Same man who had sat silently at table 3 every Tuesday. Her hands went numb. Her tea sat forgotten on the table beside her, going cold. He was Miles. Miles was him. The man who'd listened to every secret she'd whispered in the dark, who'd read about her grief, her guilt, her dreams. The man who had smiled at her across a diner booth and said nothing. Grace stared at the screen. Her heart cracked. Not because he was powerful, not because he had hidden his title, but because he hadn't trusted her with the truth. And now, she didn't know if any of it had ever been real. The next morning, Grace woke with a hollowness in her chest that no sleep could cure. Her alarm buzzed, but she didn't need it. She had barely closed her eyes. She dressed in silence, dark jeans, boots, a plain gray sweater, no makeup, no earrings, just the version of herself that no longer had energy to pretend. When she stepped into Maple Hollow Diner, she stopped dead. Jess. He was there. Gawan. Not as Miles. Not even as the quiet man from table 3. Luke Whitaker stood near the coffee counter in a navy blue blazer, clean-shaven, clipboard in hand, 2 assistants flanking him like shadows. Mr. Dalton hovered nearby, all nervous chuckles and unnecessary nods. She was inspecting the place. Calm. Methodical, like he hadn't unraveled her world the night before. Grace's heart pounded, but her face didn't change. She walked straight past him, grabbed her apron, and started her shift. Cor. He noticed her. Of course he did. Cor. His eyes found her instantly. Poor. But when he stepped forward, his mouth parting as if to speak, she turned away. No words. No eye contact. Just ice. Point. For the next half hour, Luke moved through the diner like a man fulfilling a script, asking questions about procedures, gently pointing out inefficiencies, even suggesting employee wellness initiatives. And no one saw through it. Who, no one but her. Grace wiped tables with too much force. Her hands shook. Her throat burned. But she said nothing. Koski too horch. Until she couldn't take it anymore. Kaski ribes. She walked out the back door, through the kitchen, and into the alley behind the diner, just as the sky cracked open and rain began to fall. The downpour was cold, soaking her to the skin in seconds. But she didn't stop walking. The alley blurred around her. She didn't cry until she did. Not soft, graceful tears, but shaking sobs that stung like betrayal. Footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't turn. Then a voice. Soft. Hoarse. Familiar. Grace. She spun. He was already drenched. His hair plastered to his forehead, the blazer useless against the storm. He looked nothing like a CEO. Just a man. A man who had messed up something fragile. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, he said. I never wanted to lie. She stared at him, eyes red. Then why did you? Because I didn't think you'd ever look at me the same way if you knew. I didn't want to be the man who signs your paycheck. I wanted to be someone you could trust. I wanted to be real. Her voice cracked. You were the one person I trusted. And you weren't even real. I was, he said, stepping closer. Every message, every word. I didn't fake any of that. It was the truest I've ever been. You pretended to be someone else. I was afraid. I wasn't, she whispered. That's the difference. Rain ran down her cheeks, blending with the tears she no longer tried to hide. I believed in you, she said, broken. Even when I didn't know your name, I believed in you. Luke's jaw clenched. His voice dropped. And I'm still that man, Grace. I swear it. Let me prove it. Without lies this time. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, Then let go of my wrist. He hadn't realized he was holding it. Gently, but still. His fingers slipped away. And without another word, Grace turned and walked away into the rain. Luke didn't follow. Not then, because some things had to be earned back in silence. Grace didn't quit that day. She didn't scream, didn't make a scene. She simply handed Mr. Dalton a folded letter 2 days later, signed with a steady but trembling hand. 2 weeks' notice. He nodded, confused. You sure, Grace? I'm sure. She packed her locker in silence, left her name tag in a neat pile on the break room table, and resumed her shifts with the quiet grace of someone already halfway out the door. She still smiled at customers, still offered refills and slices of pie, but something in her had shut down. Table. The light behind her eyes had dimmed. Table. Lily noticed. You haven't laughed in days. I just want this to be over, Grace replied, barely above a whisper. Every minute I'm here feels like I'm standing inside a wound. 3 days before her final shift, the first miracle arrived. Her landlord knocked, holding a maintenance invoice. Didn't ask for this, he mumbled, but some guy said he owed you more than you'd ever know. Grace blinked. The bathroom plumbing, leaky for months, had been fixed. That evening, her brother Noah, still in college, called. Hey, some scholarship thing covered next semester out of nowhere. Weird, right? She didn't reply. Her throat tightened. Her mind already knew. Blighties. More followed. The clinic that treated her mother called about a newly approved subsidy. Her mom's medication would now be fully covered. A letter arrived from the State Design Institute. Full scholarship, tuition, supplies. A personal note from the anonymous sponsor. Talent like yours deserves a chance to shine. Keep building places that feel like home. Grace folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. Her tears came not from sadness this time, but from the quiet unraveling of weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Luke never called. Never messaged. Never asked for anything. But his fingerprints were everywhere, on every burden lifted, every door quietly opened. He didn't want credit. He wanted her to feel free. And somehow, that made it harder to stay angry. One night, Grace sat on her porch under a warm wind, her phone resting in her lap. She scrolled through the old thread of messages between her and Miles. She had never blocked him. She just stopped replying. She stared at the blinking cursor in the chat box for a long, long time. Then she typed, I haven't forgiven you completely, but I'm not angry anymore. 3 dots appeared. Then, that's more than I deserve. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. But in that moment, Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Like forgiveness wasn't a door swinging open, but a window cracked just enough to let fresh air in. It didn't start with a grand apology. No flowers. No serenades beneath her window. Just coffee. 2 weeks after Grace sent that quiet message, she agreed to meet Luke. Not at Maple Hollow Diner, not at any place filled with memories, but at a small cafe halfway between her town and his, a neutral space with no history. He wore his simplest clothes, soft flannel, no jacket, no watch. She arrived in a sunflower yellow dress, hair tied loosely, nervous but not fragile. They greeted each other with soft nods, the silence between them surprisingly warm. The conversation started awkwardly. No, they talked about books, about the weather. about how Nebraska cornfields were stubborn and unpredictable, about how he once got chased by a goose on a farm tour. Grace laughed. For the first time in weeks, she laughed, and Luke's shoulders visibly softened. They didn't talk about what had happened. Not at first. He didn't bring it up. He let her lead. And that, more than any apology, earned back something valuable. Softened. Over the following weeks, they met again. In parks. At farmers' markets. On old hiking trails Grace had once loved as a child. Luke listened. Not with strategy or intent, but with presence. As if her every word was an answer to a question he hadn't known he'd carried. When Grace did finally speak about Miles, she didn't accuse. She simply asked, "What were you hoping to find, pretending to be someone else?" Luke looked down at his hands. I just wanted someone to see me. Without the noise. Without the title. And then you did. Before I even said a word." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "You could have just been honest." "I know. And I'll spend as long as it takes, proving I've learned that." So he waited. Never pushed, never rushed. If Grace texted, he replied. If she asked to meet, he came. If she needed space, he gave it. She started seeing him differently. Not as the man who had lied, but as the one who had stayed when it would have been easier to disappear. And one day, over coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls, she looked up and realized she didn't feel betrayed anymore. She felt safe. Not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of safety that let her speak her mind, laugh without filtering herself, and believe, tentatively, that maybe the most honest things in life take time to rebuild. Autumn settled gently across Nebraska, painting the fields in hues of copper and gold. The air smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon, and the horizon always seemed to hum with quiet. One evening, after walking through a grove of maple trees just outside town, Grace invited Luke in for dinner. It wasn't a date, not exactly. Just two people who were no longer strangers, sitting close enough that the silence between them felt full. Nassau Bellin, she made shepherd's pie. He brought a bottle of apple cider. They ate in the little kitchen of her farmhouse rental. Worn tile floors, cracked window panes, and one string of fairy lights she'd never bothered to take down. Afterward, they washed dishes together. No music, no rush. Just the rhythm of warm water, clinking plates, and small smiles shared over suds. When she turned to dry her hands, she noticed something sitting on the kitchen table, or us. A folded napkin, or us. No plate. No notepad. Just a napkin, blank, except for a single sentence written in familiar handwriting. "Still crushing on you. Build a life with me?" Grace stared at it. Her breath hitched. She looked up. Luke stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, nerves etched across his face like a schoolboy's. Jen, he didn't drop to one knee. He didn't have a ring. But he had his whole heart in his eyes. "I didn't want it to be about diamonds or speeches," he said. "I just wanted it to be ours." Grace walked to the table, picked up the napkin, and ran her thumb over the ink. Her chest swelled, not with surprise, but with something far deeper. Recognition. This wasn't a moment stolen from someone else's story. This was theirs. Love day eyes. She looked back at him, tears in her eyes. "You wrote me a napkin note once," she whispered, "but I guess this one's my favorite." Luke stepped closer, still waiting, still not assuming. Grace didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Vestel, though. She crossed the room in 3 barefoot steps and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him like she never wanted to let go. And when she whispered something into his shoulder, soft and certain, he knew what she meant. She was home. 1 year later, under the soft blush of a golden afternoon, Grace Summers stood barefoot in the middle of the garden she had once only imagined. Wildflowers nodded gently in the breeze, white blossoms curled around wooden trellises, and rows of hand-painted signs led guests toward a quiet meadow behind the farmhouse. She had designed it all. Every lantern, every ribbon, every twist of ivy wound through the chairs. Not for a client, not for a project, for them. Luke stood at the altar beneath a wooden arch draped in gauze and lavender, his hands folded, his breath slow but tight with emotion. His jacket hung on the back of a nearby chair. He wore suspenders over a crisp shirt and brown boots speckled with dust. Just a man, no title, waiting for the only woman who had ever seen through everything. Grace appeared from the garden path, her dress simple and soft, her hair curled with just enough wind to make it wild. She held no bouquet. She didn't need one. Her eyes were already full of life and sunlight. Luke smiled when he saw her, not the practiced smile he gave boardrooms or press cameras, but the one that came from the core of him, the one she had unlocked. They met beneath the arch, close enough to feel the steadiness of each other's breath. The officiant cleared his throat. "Before we begin, the couple has chosen to share a few words." Luke took her hands, calloused against soft fingers. "I used to think I had to earn love by building things," he said, voice quiet but certain. "Companies, visions, legacies. But you showed me I could be love just by showing up. No suits, no masks, just me." Grace's throat tightened. "I thought I had to keep proving I was worth something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But you looked at me like I already was. And somewhere between your coffee and your silence, I started believing it." The guests blinked back tears. When the officiant said, "You may seal it with a kiss," they didn't hesitate. Cocky. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. And that made it perfect. Later, as the stars blinked awake above the garden and string lights swayed overhead, the guests gathered around long wooden tables, covered in mismatched plates, homemade food, and laughter. At the center of the couple's table, framed beneath glass, was a single folded napkin. "You make the morning feel quieter in the best way. Ever thought of saying hello back?" Lily tapped her glass and grinned. "Best proposal in diner history." Everyone laughed. Even Mr. Dalton, red-faced and emotional, offered a sheepish nod as he clinked glasses with Grace. That night, Grace and Luke danced without music in the middle of the empty garden. Just the sound of insects, the wind in the trees, and hearts that had learned to trust again. "You still write the best notes," she murmured into his chest. "And you," Luke whispered back, "still make the world feel like home." They kissed beneath the stars, in a garden Grace had grown from nothing, surrounded by every piece of the life they had built. One napkin, one truth, one ordinary miracle at a time. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.